Good morning. A reading from Exodus. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Did we lose our kids? Where did our kids go? They were here just a second ago. Well, we're all going to have to be children at heart this morning. I want to start by having us ponder something. I want you to imagine that you lived in East Germany in the 70s or the 80s. So East Germany was a satellite of the Soviet Union. It was a country that didn't have a lot of freedoms, a lot of oppression. The government controlled the economy, and there were secret police everywhere. Imagine if you were living in that country. How many of the people that you know do you think would resist the oppressive government? What percent would you guess? If you had to guess a percent, how many people would want their freedom, would resist what is going on? Anybody want to throw out a guess? 10%. Okay, I'm hearing 10%. 10%. Anybody want to go higher or lower? 3. Okay, I'm hearing 3%. Sister Caroline, what do you want to go with? 50%. Every other person resisting. I love the optimism there. This week, I heard the answer to this. I heard a woman interviewed who was living in East Germany in this period. She's being interviewed by Anne Applebaum, who's a scholar of totalitarianism, of authoritarianism. And when she asked this woman this question, she looked confused. What do you mean? What percent of the people were willing to resist the government? Everybody went along. Everybody went along. Almost everybody. She said, well, how could we resist? Our jobs, our health insurance, it all depended on the government. There were secret police everywhere. There was very little way to resist. The better question is to ask those few people who did stand up, less than a percentage, what enabled them to have the courage to do that? It was kind of a chilling thing to think about. It reminded me of a Upton Sinclair quote. He was a journalist, a kind of an expose journalist at the beginning of the 20th century. He said something along the lines of this: "It is hard to get a man to understand something that will cost that man his wages." It's amazing to think about how often whole societies can become complicit with great evil because it's easier. There's a lot of pressure sometimes. This morning, we're continuing our sermon series, Resisting Pharaoh, Confronting Pharaoh. Last week, we read about these two really heroes of our faith that don't get enough credit. I think they need to, if we had a lot of money here, I'd say we should put a stained glass window to these two Hebrew midwives who stood up against Pharaoh. They are able to delay a genocide because of their courage, because they don't do what he says. But as often is the case, as we ended chapter 1 of Exodus, we hear that Pharaoh is going to kind of double down on oppression. You know, oftentimes people that have total power and control, they don't like it when people confront them, and oftentimes they respond really negatively. And that's what Pharaoh does. He had ordered these midwives to kill the male babies, and at the end of chapter 1, when they resist him, now he has ordered all the Hebrew male babies to be thrown into the Nile River. It's a dark turn that the Hebrew male babies are now going to be thrown into the river. I heard this story probably for the first time when I was 2 or 3. I can't quite remember, but I heard it on a felt board. And I remember a little felt basket being put in the reeds. And truth be told, it really didn't hit me, the impact of this story, until I became a parent myself. And, I'm a boy dad. And when you read this story when you're a boy dad, it has like an extra, it kind of punches you in the gut, right? They're throwing the baby boys in the Nile River. Parents are having to watch their babies drown. How wicked and depraved, right? It's a haunting image of how dark the human spirit can become, right? Throwing other people's babies in a river and watching them drown. New babies, right? It's a level of wickedness that's, at one level, it seems unfathomable. And I don't even think as a boy dad I can really understand this, because I imagine being, Moses' mom, a woman who's just given birth, and I don't know what that is. I've seen it, but I don't know the experience. And for these women to see their babies thrown in the Nile, terrible, right? Really almost unspeakable. It pushes my sadness and anger buttons, 3,000 years after it happened. How could Pharaoh and the Egyptians do this? And yet, so often, we see the ways that we are willing to harm babies, commit genocide. I think of this image that I have that Brother Bill warned me. He was sending me a video about what was going on in Gaza. And he said, if you watch this video, you'll never be able to get it out of your head. And he was right. And it was a video of a bomb had gone off, and the baby's dad was frantically trying to get this baby to the hospital. And much of his head was hanging out of his skull. Right? And what happened in Gaza, an unbelievable violence against babies, against children. Really a genocide. And of course, it's not just Gaza, right? Whenever there's war, whenever there's bombs, wherever, the adults fail, right? Who are the first victims in war? It's not the soldiers, right? Soldiers are certainly impacted, but it's the children, it's the women, it's the people on the home front who are having these bombs and bullets flying in their homes and neighborhoods and communities, who are dying terrible deaths. It's an unbelievable failure of the adults whenever we go to war with one another, isn't it? And of course, it's not just acts of genocide of war where babies are harmed, right? But even this past week, I read about how, as U.S. aid is being defunded by Brother Trump and his administration. There are crisis zones all over the world that aren't getting food, even though there's been some court actions and stays and different things. The food is still not flowing. You know, there are millions of people in the world right now, this morning, who aren't eating because of a decision that our president made. Not all of them are children, but certainly some of them are. It's a terrible tragedy. It's unspeakable, really, right? The depravity of that, the violence, the evil. I think of things like racism. Here in Wisconsin in 2023, they did a study. African American women and children are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. 5 times more likely to die. That is a hard number to hear. It's a hard reality to accept. But we really shouldn't accept it, should we? Why is that allowed? I think about what's going on with the methane gas plant, both one in Paris and one in Oak Creek they're proposing. There are hundreds of people who will die from pollution from this, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. It will lead to childhood asthma, and it will lead to cognitive challenges for children who are exposed to this methane. Methane is not a good thing to be exposed to. This past Wednesday, we were at the Public Service Commission, a lot of people from our church, and some friends of our church. Some of you got to meet Yusuf a couple weeks back. And at one point, is some of the construction workers were testifying. He shared with me, this feels kind of surreal, because they were acknowledging that there was some pollution going to be coming out of this and some harm, but they were talking about the importance of jobs. And it seemed kind of surreal. We're going to harm kids for the sake of jobs, and not that jobs aren't important, right? We want people to have good paying families and staying jobs. But at what cost? How do we reconcile all this? I'll just lift up one other way we see this tremendous harm being done to kids, but this past week we learned that January was the hottest year on record, or hottest January on record in human history. And it shouldn't be, because we're on a cooling cycle, not a warming cycle. And so it's actually pretty alarming that this was a record-breaking heat month. A climate scientist, in fact, kind of the original climate scientist, put out a study warning that by 2050 it's going to be much warmer than we had thought. And he was ringing the bell yet again. 2050 he was saying, we'll be passing 2 degrees Celsius. My son will be not even 30 in 2050. And the level of disruption he described in his research was haunting. I used to think that we needed to have our North Star being, we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I still stand by that. But boy, we are really not good at loving our neighbors as ourselves. Now I feel like we need to lower the bar. Can we not commit genocide and violence against infants? And we struggle so mightily as people to do that. It's so easy for us to fall into the trap of the Egyptians, to not care if infants are being so brutally harmed. Okay, we went kind of down in this story. We picked up with the Egyptians doing this violent, evil thing. But there's a lot of hope now. I'm going to try to give us some hope. We're going to meet some amazing women again this week. I'm continue to be humbled in Exodus 1 and 2, the central role that 4 women play, really 5 women, and how do we miss this as Christians? And the only explanation is patriarchy, right, in our tradition. How do we miss that there are such strong, brave, courageous women? And the first woman we meet in this story is Moses' mother. She gives birth to Moses, and she sees this baby, and she adores him. She's not willing to do what the Pharaoh wants. She's not willing to throw her baby in the river. she's not willing to go along with this, even though the Pharaoh has great power, right? Because we're going to learn some of the things a little bit later that Pharaoh can do, but right, he can take away the straw that people need. He can tell you need to make more bricks. He can take away your food. He can make you work longer hours. Presumably, a lot of the Hebrew women went along because they were scared. But Moses' mother sees Moses, and she can't do it. She's not going to go along. It's really a haunting moment if you think about it, right? She's given birth to this baby. The Pharaoh, who has all the power, wants her to throw her baby in the river, and she doesn't do it. It's a terrible bind. And it's not like, we realize that she's going to have an issue because she can't keep hiding this baby. 3 months in, it's getting harder and harder as this baby's getting bigger and presumably maybe crying louder. How do I keep hiding my baby? And she doesn't want to see her baby thrown into the river and drowned. So what does she do? Well, as I was taught this story, I was always taught this was a story of great faith. And that maybe God even kind of told her that she should do this thing and put Moses in the river and God would take care of her. And yet if you read this closely, which I'd encourage you to do, and which we did this morning, it doesn't say that God promises that Moses will be spared. There's no angelic visitor for Moses' mom. There's no insight that God is going to spare her baby. It seems as we read the text that she is committed to not watching her son be drowned in front of her eyes. It seems like she's in a moment of great desperation. I don't want my son to be drowned, so you know what? I'm going to put him in a box. The Hebrew word for basket's more like ark. And, we should probably presume that it was like a sealed box that she puts her child in. The best chance of it floating down the river successfully. But the chances of this working out are not high. This river is not like a little creek. This is one of the biggest rivers in the world. It's a wide river. It's got currents. It's got all sorts of water, and this baby's in a little straw basket. There's alligators, there's hippos, there's all sorts of stuff in the Nile River. There's all sorts of ways for this story to end tragically, that Moses' sister is on the bank. This is really probably a pretty grisly chore that she's been given. She is probably going along the bank, waiting to report back to her mother a grisly ending for what has happened. Yet Moses' mother knows something. It's better to give yourself a chance than to just submit. She is not going to let Pharaoh and his troops put her baby in the river and watch her baby drown. She does not give up. She does not despair. Even though it seems like a 1 in 1,000, she is willing to seal her baby in the box and put him in the river, hoping and trusting that somehow it will work out. This act is both heart-wrenching to me to think about the desperation that she's experiencing and the hopelessness she must have been feeling in that moment. But it also gives me such great courage because rather than submit, she said, I'm going to give it a whirl. I'm going to put my baby in this box. I'm going to hope. I'm going to pray. I'm going to have faith that somehow God is going to do something that I don't understand. Somehow my child will be okay. It's an unbelievable moment. An unbelievable moment of courage and willing to resist and willing not to despair. Right? And so often the temptation is to despair and to think that things are hopeless. And Moses' mom is like the opposite of that. She is going to go down trying everything she can. And even though it doesn't say she had faith or that God somehow playing a role in this, presumably she had faith. She had faith that somehow God could work in this action of putting her baby in a box. It's an amazing role model to me of somebody who never quits, who never despairs, who never gives up before she has to. Now, it's not just Moses' mom in this story that does really bold and brave things. This sealed box floats down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds it. Okay, we've probably all heard this story so many times, it's easy to miss, what's going on. Pharaoh is the guy that has ordered this genocide. The Egyptians are the bad guys in this story, right? They're the evil, wicked ones. And certainly Pharaoh and Pharaoh's family, that's the inner circle of this genocide. If we didn't know how the story ends, it seems like this is going to go very bad. Maybe she's going to poke it with a stick and sink it, or overturn it, or do something evil and wicked. That's what we would probably be expecting from Pharaoh's daughter. She's going to go along with dad, right? And she's getting a lot of benefits by being Pharaoh's daughter, right? And in Egypt, it's good being the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh has so much power and wealth and control. And yet that's not what happens. Now, there's a little bit of a hard part of this passage. So she is aware that this is a Hebrew baby. And that's probably a pretty grisly fact. When I was in seminary, one of my professors pointed out, well, why did she know it was a Hebrew baby? Well, presumably it's because there have been Hebrew babies coming down the Nile, but not living Hebrew babies, right? The way this genocide is happening is the babies are being thrown into the river. And presumably when she's going down to bathe, and there's over 300,000 Hebrews at this point, so there's probably a lot of babies being born. This is pretty grisly, right? There's probably a flow of human babies floating down this river. And therefore, she's kind of aware of what's going on. And she sees this baby in a basket, in a box. And she has pity. She has mercy. It's super surprising, right? She's part of the wicked family. She's the last person we'd think would ever want to pull this baby out. And yet she sees this baby, and she has pity. She has mercy. It's a beautiful twist. It's a beautiful reminder. The Hebrew scriptures are really shocking. Not just the Hebrew scriptures, but the New Testament is also shocking this way. Most faith traditions, most stories, who are the heroes in most stories? It's people that look like the people telling the stories, right? You go look at other religions and other national stories, right? And if this was a traditional story, right? It'd be all Hebrew people that are the heroes and all Egyptian people that are wicked. But that's not what happens in the Hebrew scriptures generally, right? There's all these people that aren't God's people, that aren't Hebrews, that end up playing hero roles. The Pharaoh's daughter, the wicked guy's daughter, she becomes a hero. She shows pity. She drags Moses out of the river. It reminds us of two things. There's two really important things in this. The first is God is working beyond God's people. It's an amazing thing in our scriptures that God is not contained to one group of people. And we see this throughout scripture, right? God is always out doing more than God's people can imagine. Right? We're going to see this over and over again, right? Because, whether it be Pharaoh's daughter, whether it be Rahab, whether it be so many people, right? There's always people outside of God's people that are doing God's will. It's really an unbelievable thing, and that is true to this very day. right? There's always people outside of the church who are doing God's will. And we need to be mindful of that. And we can bump into all sorts of people that are on the God plan, on the God mission, who maybe don't even realize they're on the God mission. It's a hugely important part of our faith. But it's not only important that God is working beyond the Hebrew people, it's important to be mindful that God works in people that seem like they should be our enemies. The Pharaoh's daughter, she's an Egyptian, ends up saving Moses. It's shocking. And it's this beautiful reminder that we can never count anybody out. There is nobody, regardless of what their nationality or family heritage or position in society, who can't wake up one morning and be merciful. It's a beautiful reminder. We can't write any of God's children out. It's a tough reminder. Because, right, there's certainly times where there's certainly people and groups of people, and especially when there's a lot of wickedness going on, where we want to paint with a big brush, right? And yet this story reminds us to be open for surprises. There are people that we can expect and hope to be merciful, to show pity, that we would never expect. And there's a lot of hope in that, right? And I think we, as American Christians, need to hear that in this moment, right? Because it's really easy to start demonizing each other. And and what happens when we demonize each other? Well, then, this little problem happens that, the divide gets even worse. Right? And I believe in this moment there's going to be a lot of people, maybe who have made some pretty bad decisions, maybe who are part of some stuff that we have dedicated our lives to resisting, who might wake up one day and be merciful, who might wake up one day and decide they want to show some pity. I think we need to be ready to celebrate and welcome those acts. We can celebrate mercy no matter who commits them. We started this morning thinking about how much courage, how unlikely it is that anybody will resist. And yet this morning we saw these beautiful actions. We saw Moses' mom, against all odds, will never submit. We saw Pharaoh's daughter, the most surprising person, wake up one day and show pity. Although most people will not resist, most people will go along, there are always some people who don't. And I know here at Grace, I'm looking at a congregation full of people that will always show mercy, no matter what the cost. Amen.